February 2nd, 1943. Deep beneath the frozen, pulverized remains of what was once a thriving industrial city on the Volga, the air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and unwashed despair. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, promoted to that rank by Adolf Hitler only hours earlier with the unspoken expectation that he would commit suicide, sat at a makeshift wooden table. He did not reach for his service pistol. The surrender of the Sixth Army was more than a military defeat, it was a psychic fracture in the heart of the Third Reich. For months, the German public had been fed a diet of inevitable victory, told that the Bolshevik hordes were on the verge of collapse. But as the final radio transmissions flickered out from the Stalingrad pocket, a terrifying realization began to settle over the High Command in East Prussia. The invincibility of the Wehrmacht had been buried under the Russian snow, along with 200,000 of its finest soldiers. Across the front lines, the German officer corps, men raised on the Prussian tradition of strategic brilliance, watched in horrified silence. They knew the maps. They saw the gaping hole in the southern wing of the Eastern Front. To the world, Stalingrad was a turning point. To the German generals, it was the moment they realized they were no longer fighting for a 1,000-year Reich, but for their very survival. The mask of the master race had slipped, revealing the grim, frozen face of total catastrophe. February 3rd, 1943. At the Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair, the atmosphere was not one of mourning, but of a suffocating, hysterical tension. Adolf Hitler had retreated into a cocoon of denial, his rage directed not at his own strategic failures, but at the cowardice of Field Marshal Paulus. To Hitler, the surrender was a personal betrayal. He paced the narrow corridors of his concrete bunker, ranting to his inner circle. "The man has no pride," Hitler spat, according to the diaries of those present. He could have freed himself from all sorrow and ascended into eternity and national immortality, but he prefers to go to Moscow. But while the Führer obsessed over the optics of the surrender, his generals were staring at a collapsing reality. General Kurt Zeitzler, the chief of the Army General Staff, had spent weeks pleading for a breakout that never came. Now, he sat in silence as the reports flowed in. The Sixth Army was gone, the Fourth Panzer Army was reeling, and the Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians had been effectively wiped off the map. The southern sector of the Eastern Front was a vacuum, a 1,000-mile wound that the Red Army was now pouring into with vengeful fury. In the privacy of their quarters, away from the prying ears of the Gestapo, the talk among the High Command turned dark. General Oberst Wolfram von Richthofen, commander of the 4th Air Fleet, wrote bitterly in his diary about the leadership from the clouds that had doomed his pilots and the men on the ground. The professional soldiers knew what the politicians refused to admit: the initiative had passed to the Soviets. The myth of the Blitzkrieg was dead. In its place was a war of attrition, a Vernichtungskrieg, war of annihilation, that Germany was no longer equipped to win. The master of the Volga was now the master of nothing but a graveyard. February 12, 1943. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably the most brilliant strategist in the German High Command, stood before a wall-sized map at his headquarters in Army Group Dawn. The red arrows of the Soviet Operation Gallop were slicing through his lines like a hot knife through butter. For Manstein, Stalingrad wasn't just a tragedy, it was a professional insult. He had tried to save the Sixth Army with Operation Winter Storm, only to be held back by Hitler's stand-fast orders until the relief force was mere miles from the pocket. Now, he faced a much larger aftermath, 1946 to 1955. For the handful of generals who survived both the war and the brutal Soviet gulags, the decade following the surrender was a time of bitter reflection. In the cold light of post-war reality, the excuses of following orders began to crumble. At the Nuremberg trials and in various prisoner-of-war camps, the survivors, including Field Marshal Paulus, faced a devastating question: how did the most sophisticated military machine in history allow itself to be led into a tactical and moral abyss? In their memoirs, generals like Manstein and Guderian would later try to distance themselves from the catastrophe, blaming Hitler's incompetence for the loss. They painted themselves as tragic professionals sabotaged by a madman. But the historical record tells a darker story. Stalingrad had exposed the pact with the devil that the German High Command had signed years earlier. By trading their tactical independence for the promise of conquest, they had surrendered their right to protest when the orders became suicidal. Today, the fields around the Volga still yield the iron harvest, rusted bayonets, cracked goggles, and the dog tags of men who were told they were invincible. For the German generals, Stalingrad remained the ultimate symbol of a double defeat. They lost the war on March 1943. While the front lines continued to bleed, a new and unsettling sound began to emanate from the east, the voices of the captured. In the Soviet prisoner of war camps, the hierarchy of the Wehrmacht was undergoing a radical, forced transformation. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, once the quintessential obedient officer, found himself in a Spartan cell, stripped of his medals and his purpose. But he was not alone. Dozens of German generals had been captured in the ruins, and for the first time in their lives, they were free from Hitler's Führer principle because they had already lost everything. In these cold, guarded rooms, the conversation was no longer about tactical maneuvers, but about the soul of the German military. General Walther von Seydlitz-Gersbach, a hero of the early campaigns, became the leading voice of dissent. He began to argue openly that the war was lost and that the only way to save Germany from total annihilation was to depose Hitler. The Seydlitz group began broadcasting appeals back to the German lines, urging their comrades to surrender. To the High Command in Berlin, these were the voices of traitors. To the men in the trenches, they were the echoes of a nightmare they were still living. The psychological impact on the remaining generals at the front was devastating. They were caught in a pincer movement of their own between the advancing Red Army and the fanatical demands of the Nazi Party. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the panzer divisions, noted the creeping Stalingrad syndrome among his staff, a mixture of fatalism and a sudden, sharp interest in the political reality of the war. They saw the letters from the front, censored and grim, and they heard the silence of the families who would never receive a body to bury. The unbreakable bond between the Führer and his generals had been permanently severed. What remained was a marriage of convenience, held together only by the fear of what the Soviets would do if they ever reached Berlin. February 18, 1943. While the generals contemplated their maps in grim silence, the Nazi leadership decided to turn the catastrophe into a weapon of mass mobilization. In the Berlin Sportpalast, Joseph Goebbels stood before a hand-picked, frenzied crowd and delivered his most famous oration. He didn't hide the disaster at Stalingrad, he used it to stoke a primal fear. "Do you want total war?" he roared, and the crowd screamed back in the affirmative. But behind the scenes, the military elite viewed this total Krieg speech with deep cynicism. They knew that passion and propaganda could not manufacture the Tiger tanks or the trained pilots that had been incinerated on the Volga. For General Staff officers like Henning von Treschow, Stalingrad was the final moral proof that Hitler was leading Germany to its doom. The Stalingrad shadow began to lengthen over the resistance movements within the army. It was no longer just about political disagreement, it was about preventing the literal erasure of the German nation. In secret meetings, officers discussed how the Sixth Army had been lied to, left to starve, and then told to die for a heroic myth. The professional code of the officer corps, loyalty to the state, was now in direct conflict with their duty to the survival of their men. The loss of Stalingrad also changed the way the generals interacted with Hitler. The atmosphere at the daily situation conferences became toxic. Hitler's distrust of his generals peaked. He began to micromanage every battalion, convinced that his commanders were soft or defeatist. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the OKW, noted that the atmosphere was one of perpetual crisis. The generals were now trapped in a cycle of impossible orders. If they retreated to save their men, they were fired or court-martialed. If they stayed, they were destroyed. The prestige of the uniform had been traded for the fanaticism of the bunker, and the cost was being paid in blood every single day.